report is exposing a surge in the number of short-term stays across the state, leaving some towns with zero long-term rentals.
If you live in one of these 7 Australian cities, you need to decide whether to get out now, because by 2028, their rental markets will be gutted by Airbnb-style short stays. The platforms keep insisting short-term rentals are only about 2% of Australia's housing stock, too tiny to matter. But when you zoom into the real hotspots, the data shows something completely different. In parts of the Mornington Peninsula, Hobart, the Gold Coast and the Northern Rivers, high single-digit or even double-digit shares of all homes have already been swallowed by short-stay listings, vacancy has snapped towards zero, and long-term rents have been blasted into the stratosphere. Number 1. Cairns. Cairns is the surprise opener because most people still think of it as a laid-back gateway to the reef, with plenty of rentals and a low-wage tourism economy that keeps things affordable. The data says something completely different. A few years ago, the Queensland government ordered a specific investigation into what they called the Airbnb effect after the local vacancy rate crashed to around 0.5%. A record low, at the same time as short-stay listings exploded. In that work, officials pointed out there were just over 2,000 short-term listings in Cairns and that the average weekly rent for a 3-bedroom house had jumped about 13.5% in 12 months, with overall rents up nearly 10%. 2-bedroom units were sitting around $400 a week. A typical 3-bedroom home was getting close to $500. The same analysis put the average short-stay nightly rate in Cairns at about $260, more than $1,500 a week. Fast forward to 2026, and specialist data firm ROI puts the number of active short-stay listings in Cairns at 868, with supply up roughly 50.7% in just a year. A nightly rate of about $179 and hosts earning around $30,000 a year on average. When one dataset says there are just over 2,000 short stays and another says about 900, the exact number matters less than the pattern. The short stay sector has already become an established market in its own right, in a city where local wages are not exploding, but rents are. The tourism brochure promises a tropical city where you can work in hospitality or health and still rent a basic house near the beach. But the data delivers a market where short stays are paying 2 to 3 times what a local family can pay. Vacancy has already been squeezed towards the floor, and the state government has openly admitted it is still trying to get a full picture of how much damage these platforms are doing. If you think Cairns is a one-off regional story, the next city on this list shows what happens when short-stay platforms embed themselves in one of the tightest and most expensive rental markets in the country. Number 2. The Gold Coast. The Gold Coast is the textbook case of a tourist city where Airbnb money and rental desperation now sit on top of each other. According to the City of Gold Coast and multiple market reports, there are more than 11,000 short-stay properties registered across the region, and roughly that same number listed on Airbnb alone. At the same time, research based on Australian Bureau of Statistics census snapshots and follow-up analysis has highlighted that roughly 1 in 10 homes in parts of Queensland, including coastal areas, were sitting empty on census night, even as thousands of households across the state struggled with homelessness or severe housing stress. A 2024 rental market breakdown put the vacancy rate on the Gold Coast at just 1.5%, a level the Real Estate Institute of Queensland classifies as a tight market where there simply are not enough rentals coming up for lease. On the rental side, asking rents for houses on the Gold Coast have been recorded at around $949 a week and about $780 for units, making it more expensive to rent there than in Brisbane or Melbourne in many cases. On the short stay side, data from providers like Airbnb and other analytics firms shows roughly 10 to 11,000 active listings, with a typical nightly rate in the high 200s, occupancy between roughly the mid-40% range and the high 70% range, and median gross revenues pushing towards $90,000 a year for well-located properties. In other words, if you own an entire apartment in a tourist precinct, the mathematics of shifting it out of long-term rental into full-time short stay is brutal and obvious. The tourism brochure promises a glitzy strip where investors build wealth, families enjoy beachside living, and there is something for everyone. But the data delivers a region where thousands of dwellings have already been flooded into the short stay pool. Vacancy has been squeezed to crisis levels, and tenants are being forced into house sharing and long commutes because so many buildings effectively operate as hotels. And if you think this is as bad as it gets, the next region on the list has entire towns where local councils have resorted to day caps to stop an outright takeover. Number 3, Byron Bay and the Northern Rivers. For a decade, Byron Bay has been marketed as the ultimate lifestyle escape, creative capital, surf town, yoga retreats, music festivals, and eco-luxury guest houses. On the ground, the data shows a community being gutted by short stays. Independent mapping projects such as Inside Airbnb and detailed regional research have repeatedly highlighted that the Northern Rivers region has some of the highest concentrations of entire homes listed on platforms relative to the size of the local housing stock. Byron Shire itself has had to adopt a special planning framework just to survive. Non-hosted short-stay accommodation, properties where the owner does not live on site, is now generally capped at 60 days a year in most of the Shire, with only certain mapped zones in Byron Bay and Brunswick Heads allowed to operate 365 days a year. Even with those rules, council and media reports cite roughly 1,300 holiday homes registered across Byron Shire, with hundreds of those sitting inside the new 60-day cap areas, and the rest concentrated in exempt oceanfront precincts that can still run all year. Combine that with national findings that in some hotspots short-term rentals make up high single-digit shares of all dwellings. And it is not hard to see why renters in the Northern Rivers routinely report having to compete with 30 or 40 applications for a basic house. The tourism brochure promises a bohemian community where locals and visitors coexist. Everyone surfs at sunrise, and housing is tight but manageable, but the data delivers a shire where locals have already been pushed into surrounding towns, car parks, and temporary accommodation, while investors fight to keep 365-day short-stay rights inside a shrinking set of exempt zones. And Byron is not the only place in Australia where the ratio of tourists to locals has snapped. Further south and across Bass Strait, one city has numbers so extreme that academics now use it as the case study for what destroyed by Airbnb actually looks like. Number 4, Hobart. Hobart used to be the cheap capital, the place mainlanders thought of as safe and affordable, where you could still rent a house with a yard without being bled dry. The data out of Tasmania now reads like a warning label. Unlike most states, Tasmania requires detailed registration and reporting for short-term accommodation, which means researchers can actually see what is happening rather than guessing. In a recent interview on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, a University of Sydney planning expert explained that in December 2024, whole property short-stay listings in Hobart outnumbered long-term rental vacancies by 36 to 1. 36 to 1. That is not a distortion, that is a hollowed-out rental market. AirDNA data shows around 1,400 to 1,500 active short-stay listings in Greater Hobart, with occupancy rates roughly in the mid-60% range, nightly rates around $180 to $182, and typical annual revenues over $29,000. For an owner, those numbers are intoxicating. For a nurse, chef, or teacher trying to find a lease, they are devastating, because it means hundreds of dwellings that could have been long-term rentals are locked up in a churn of weekend visitors and festival traffic. The tourism brochure promises a small, artistic capital city where you can work in the hospital, the university, or a cafe, and still live within 20 minutes of the waterfront. But the data delivers a city where short-stay vacancy already outnumbers long-term vacancy by more than 30 to 1, and renters are forced into bidding wars or out of the region entirely. If you think Hobart is extreme because it has unique rules, look at what is happening in Noosa, where the council is fighting the same battle without the benefit of a statewide register. Number 5. Noosa. Noosa has always sold itself as the quiet, upmarket escape from southeast Queensland chaos, national park walks, riverfront dining, and a supposedly relaxed coastal community. Beneath that image, the housing system is being destroyed in slow motion by the very tourism economy that pays the bills. For years, local first responders and essential workers in Noosa, police, paramedics, firefighters, have been telling reporters they are being forced to live well outside the region because there are simply not enough long-term rentals left anywhere near the Shire. One 2025 report quoted the local Member of Parliament saying bluntly that the region needed short-stay owners to move their properties back into the long-term pool, just so frontline workers could live among the community they serve. Noosa Shire Council has already introduced one of the toughest local short-stay regimes in Queensland: mandatory approvals, a 24-hour complaints hotline, and the power to cancel permits for problem properties. Local news coverage has highlighted that hundreds of short-stay properties have been pushed back into the long-term market over recent years as approvals lapsed or owners cancelled them under pressure. Yet the housing squeeze remains because the starting point was so dire. The tourism brochure promises a pristine, community-minded surf town where visitors and locals share the same streets. But the data delivers a region where essential workers already have to commute from outside the Shire, short stays are still lucrative, and councils are openly signalling that even tougher rules are on the table if nothing changes. And Noosa is not the only lifestyle region where the numbers have snapped. On the opposite side of the continent, in Western Australia's wine and surf belt, councils are now willing to ban new holiday homes outright in some suburbs just to stop communities being wiped. Number 6, Margaret River and Busselton. The Margaret River and Busselton corridor is one of Western Australia's crown jewel tourism regions. Wineries, surf breaks, forests and boutique stays. For years, the promise has been that holiday homes and Airbnbs just spread visitors around and top up local incomes. But as the data has accumulated, local governments have started sounding the alarm. The city of Busselton has estimated that around 8% of all properties in its area are registered as unhosted short-term rental accommodation, entire homes used full-time as holiday houses. That might not sound huge until you remember that in a normally functioning rental market, vacancy rates of about 3% are considered healthy. Removing something like 8% of the entire stock from year-round use is enormous. In 2025, Busselton Council responded by adopting a new policy that bans new unhosted holiday homes in a long list of what it calls non-preferred residential areas, parts of Vassar, Keighley, Dunsborough, East Busselton and other family suburbs. Existing approved holiday homes can keep operating, but once an approval lapses, it cannot be renewed. Statewide, Western Australia has moved to introduce a mandatory short-stay register and incentives to encourage owners to convert properties back to the long-term market. explicitly citing the need to protect residents in tourist towns. The tourism brochure promises a region where locals and visitors share the good life in balance. But the data delivers a housing system where nearly 1 in 12 dwellings, in some shires, is already a full-time holiday home. Rents are climbing, and councils have resorted to bans and punitive rate rises just to stop entire residential estates turning into resorts. All of this leads to the Closer, the city where many people in this audience either live, work, or dream of moving, the inner suburbs of Sydney. Number 7, the city of Sydney inner suburbs. When people think about Airbnb and Sydney, they picture Bondi or Manly, but the real front line is in the inner city. Surrey Hills, Darlinghurst, Potts Point, and the central business district fringe. These are the postcodes where tens of thousands of renters try to live near jobs and transport, and where short-stay platforms see some of their highest nightly rates. Independent mapping projects and policy reports used by national think tanks routinely show that inner Sydney has some of the highest concentrations of entire dwellings on Airbnb in the country. At the same time, city-level vacancy data has spent most of the last 2 years scraping along near historic lows, with many inner-ring suburbs hovering around 1 to 2% vacancy at best. Things have now reached the point where the City of Sydney Council has voted to investigate banning short-term rentals, such as Airbnb and stays, in select suburbs when rental vacancy rates slip below critical thresholds. Public reporting has referenced vacancy triggers as low as 3% in early discussions, meaning Council is openly considering a system where entire neighbourhoods flip from short-stay free for all to no new short stays based on how tight the rental market becomes. The tourism brochure promises a global city where visitors can live like a local, stay in real homes, close to nightlife and transport, and inject money into the community. But the data delivers a reality where entire blocks of studio and one-bedroom apartments are effectively hotels. Renters have already been squeezed into outer rings, and the city is now weighing suburb by suburb bans just to stop the system snapping completely. So if the pattern is this clear, why do bans and caps not simply fix it? This is where it gets more complicated and more frustrating. The illusion of the simple fix is powerful. A 60-day or 180-day cap sounds like a hammer blow. A statewide 7.5% levy sounds like serious pain for hosts. A council ban on new unhosted holiday homes in certain suburbs sounds like a clean reset. But when you actually look at the data, you see how easily these policies can be blunted or sidestepped. Airbnb itself loves to point to a University of Canberra and Urbis research program which, using its own data, found no consistent relationship between the proportion of homes used as short-term rentals and long-term rental affordability at the national level, and argued that harsh caps would have minimal impact on rents. Early analysis of Victoria's short-stay levy suggests that listings in that state continued to grow between 2023 and 2025, even after the levy was announced and introduced, with tens of thousands of properties still operating in the short-stay market. Internationally, near bans in some cities have led to side effects like rising hotel prices or hosts moving to informal channels rather than genuinely freeing up affordable rentals. In Australia, the platforms argue, and some housing economists agree, that focusing only on short-term rentals misses the deeper drivers of the crisis: decades of underbuilding, investor tax settings that favour capital gains, and weak protections for renters. There is truth in that, but in the 7 cities and regions we have just talked through, short stays are not theoretical. They are visible in lockboxes on doorways, dark apartments mid-week, and data that shows dozens of holiday vacancies for every one long-term vacancy in the most distorted markets. The promise is that you can cap nights, register properties, charge a small levy and call it a day. The reality is that without serious new long-term supply and enforcement with teeth, the system mostly just rearranges the chairs. Well-capitalized investors adapt. They absorb the levy, shift to direct bookings, or pivot to other markets. Local communities still bleed population and watch their rental options evaporate. So if bans and levies on their own will not magically fix these 7 cities, what can you actually do as a renter, a local owner, or a small investor caught in the crossfire of this Airbnb-driven reset? If you are renting in one of these cities or planning to, you are on the front line of the destruction. The data has already shown that in places like Cairns, Hobart, Mornington Peninsula, and parts of the Gold Coast, the combination of tight vacancy and high short-stay penetration has squeezed choice, pushed up rents, and forced people into precarious arrangements. The first thing you can do is pay attention, because local rules are changing fast. Councils in Byron, Noosa, Busselton, Sydney and Brisbane are all running or planning consultations on caps, bans, registration schemes and rate hikes. Those processes are often the only moment locals get to push back before a policy is locked in for years. The second thing is to keep an eye on the hard numbers in your area. Watch the rental vacancy rate and median rent in your region through sources like national rental index providers, state real estate institutes, and local releases from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. If those numbers are already extreme and still getting worse, that tells you how urgent your own timeline needs to be. Use the comments under videos like this as a kind of local intelligence network. When someone in Hobart posts that there were 36 short-stay vacancies for every one long-term listing, or someone on the peninsula posts that agents are getting 50 applications per house, that is the kind of ground truth that takes months to show up in official reports. The more you share what you are seeing, more lockboxes, fewer rentals, sudden rent hikes, the clearer the national pattern becomes. If you are a local homeowner who is not currently using Airbnb, you are in a complicated position. In the short term, heavy short-stay saturation in your suburb can prop up your paper property value because it pushes up sale prices for houses with short-stay potential, and it keeps rental yields high. In the medium term, that same saturation can destroy livability and community. Councils like Busselton have already had to carve out non-preferred areas where new, unhosted holiday homes are banned just to stop residential estates hollowing out. Noosa has had to design an entire approvals and enforcement regime because locals were complaining about noise, parking and antisocial behaviour alongside the housing shortage. Every time a household says, "If it gets too hard, I will just put it on a short-stay platform," they are not making a neutral decision. They are choosing between short-term yield and long-term neighbourhood stability. That does not mean you should never run a holiday let. It means you should go into it understanding that if enough of your neighbours do the same thing, your children's teachers, your local paramedics, and the person who makes your coffee may simply not be able to live anywhere near you. If you value community as well as capital, those trade-offs matter. For small-scale investors, the key shift between now and 2028 is political risk. In short, stay-dependent cities and regions, the regulatory ground is moving under your feet. Victoria's 7.5% levy shows that state governments are willing to tax short stays. Noosa's and Busselton's local laws show councils are willing to cap or ban new properties. Western Australia's Register and Incentive Scheme shows a state is willing to pay you to exit the game. Sydney's investigation into bans below certain vacancy thresholds shows big cities are prepared to go suburb by suburb. You cannot treat short-stay income projections as fixed for the next decade. If you already own in one of these markets, you should be stress-testing your numbers under 3 shocks. Fewer nights booked, higher statutory costs, and being forced back into long-term rental at lower yields. Look at what your cash flow looks like if occupancy drops 10 percentage points, if a levy adds several percent to your gross takings, but you cannot pass it all on, or if a new local rule caps you at 60 or 90 nights a year unless you live on site. The data from places like Victoria and Tasmania shows that once governments discover the political popularity of cracking down on Airbnb, they rarely move back to a looser regime. If you are thinking about buying into a short-stay dependent city between now and 2028, ask yourself a blunt question. If a 60-day cap, a 5 to 7% levy, and a forced shift to long-term rental wiped half your projected income, would this deal still make sense? If the answer is no, you are not buying an investment. You are buying a bet that voters and politicians will leave the current settings alone in the middle of a housing crisis. The last few years of policy changes say that is a very optimistic bet. The people who get blindsided in every housing crisis are never the ones who saw the pattern early. They are the ones who kept telling themselves, it is only a few Airbnbs. It cannot really matter, right up until their rent doubled, their street turned into a hotel corridor, or their council banned the business model they were relying on. You have just seen the data the brochures and the platforms will never show you. National short-term rental share, only 1 to 2% on average, but around 8% of all properties in Busselton registered as holiday homes. Short stays outnumbering rental vacancies 36 to 1 in Hobart, tens of thousands of holiday listings on the Gold Coast alone, and similar pressures building on the Mornington Peninsula and in other tourist belts. What you do with that now is the difference between being trapped in a destroyed rental market or quietly positioning yourself in a place that still functions like a community. If this video helped you see past the "it is only 2% talking point and into the numbers that actually govern your rent and your street, tap the like button so we can get this information in front of every renter and local before another long-term rental disappears behind a lockbox. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because I will keep tracking where Airbnb and other platforms are quietly gutting rental markets and where the data says you still have a fighting chance. And tell me in the comments what city or town you are in and what you are seeing on the ground. Are there more lockboxes? Fewer rentals, sudden rent hikes, any moves by your council on short-stay rules? Your local stories are the first place this destruction shows up, long before it makes it into an official report. This video is general information only. It is based on publicly available data and commentary as at mid-2026, and it does not take into account your personal circumstances. It is not financial advice, it is not legal advice, and it is not tax advice. Before you make any decision about renting, buying, selling, or investing in property, you should do your own research and speak with a licensed financial advisor, a qualified tax professional, or another registered professional who understands your situation.